Every great story begins with a place. A coastline, a wave, a moment where the land meets the sea and something stirs inside a person that no career path, no accounting textbook, no ordinary life could ever satisfy. His name was Brian Smith. In the late 1970s, he was a young Australian studying accounting, a perfectly sensible career. But every free hour, every weekend, every spare breath was spent in the water. Surfing wasn't a hobby for Brian, it was the only language that made sense. Back on shore, Australian surfers had a ritual as old as the sport itself on that continent. After coming out of cold water, they'd slip their feet into thick sheepskin boots. Rough, handmade, deeply unglamorous. Nobody called them fashion, they were just warm. But when the waves died down, Brian Smith returned to his other world. University lectures, ledgers, balance sheets, the life that was expected of him. A life that, somewhere deep inside, never quite fit. Then, one day, a song came on the radio. Nobody knows exactly which song it was, but Brian Smith has described that moment as the instant everything changed. The spark that made him stop, put down his books and think, what if I just went? He made the decision quickly, almost recklessly. He packed his surfboards, his sheepskin boots, and what little money he had, and bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. Brian Smith was 20-something years old, with no business plan, no investors, and no guarantee of anything. Thousands of miles of ocean separated who Brian Smith was from who he was about to become. The flight from Sydney to Los Angeles crosses the largest body of water on Earth, a journey that, in every sense, felt like the point of no return. California. In the late 1970s, it was everything the rest of the world dreamed about. The sun, the beach, the promise of reinvention. For a young Australian with 2 surfboards and a bag of sheepskin boots, it was the only place on Earth where the idea forming in his mind could possibly come to life. The surf culture Brian Smith found in California was electric, but it was also different from home. These were surfers born under the same sun, chasing the same waves, and yet something was missing. After their sessions in the cold Pacific, American surfers walked straight back to their cars. No sheepskin boots, no warm ritual, just cold, wet feet on cold, wet sand. Brian Smith noticed. He noticed the way you only notice something when you've known the solution your whole life. The Pacific Ocean off the California coast is deceiving. The sun is warm, the beaches are golden, but the water, fed by cold northern currents, is brutally cold, especially at dawn and dusk. Every surfer who stepped out of that water knew exactly what their body was missing. The idea arrived the way all the best ideas do, not as a grand revelation, but as something so obvious it was almost embarrassing. Australians solved this problem years ago. Why hadn't anyone brought it here? Sheepskin. Natural, dual purpose. The wool on the inside to warm, the suede on the outside to protect. Australian farmers and surfers had known its power for decades. It was one of the most effective natural insulators ever discovered, and it was sitting right there, waiting for a market. Brian Smith didn't come to California with a polished business plan. He came with an instinct. He began sketching out the simplest possible product, a low boot, sheepskin inside and out, no nonsense, no fashion, just function, just warmth. Every great founding story has a co-pilot. For Brian Smith, that person was Doug Jensen, a business-minded partner who saw potential in the same idea Brian couldn't stop talking about. Together, they would take the first concrete steps toward turning a surfer's hunch into a company. The first UGG boots were nothing elaborate. No technology, no branding, no retail packaging. Just thick twin-face sheepskin stitched into a simple boot shape and sold with a flat rubber base. They were honest, almost primitive, and they were exactly right. In 1978, Brian Smith and Doug Jensen took one of the most important legal steps any entrepreneur can take. They registered the name UGG as a trademark in the United States, planting a flag in territory no one else had claimed. At least, not in America. The company was UGG Imports. The year was 1978. There was no office, no warehouse, no staff, no investors. There was a name, a trademark, a van, and two men who believed that American surfers were missing something they didn't yet know they needed. The distribution network for UGG Imports consisted entirely of one vehicle, a beat-up van. Brian Smith would load it with boxes of sheepskin boots and drive to beaches, surf spots, and parking lots. This was the supply chain. This was the warehouse. This was the office. The first UGG sales office was the back of that van, parked at Malibu Beach. Brian Smith would open the rear doors and try to convince passing surfers to try on a pair of sheepskin boots. Most of them thought he was crazy. Brian Smith's biggest challenge wasn't selling to surfers on the beach, it was getting through the front door of surf shops. Shop owners looked at the sheepskin boots, laughed, or shook their heads. Ugly. Too weird. Won't sell. Rejection after rejection after rejection. For years, not weeks, not months, but years, Brian Smith kept going. He kept loading the van. He kept knocking on doors. He kept hearing no. The history of UGG, like the history of most great brands, is mostly a history of not giving up. Then came San Diego, a smaller surf shop, a different kind of salesperson behind the counter, a young, open-minded surfer who worked the shop on weekends. He didn't dismiss Brian Smith at the door. Instead, he did something no one else had thought to do. He called some friends. A group of young surfers gathered around the van. The shop employee handed them each a pair of boots and said, "Just try them." No sales pitch, no pressure, just sheepskin touching cold, salt-raw feet for the very first time. The reaction was immediate. Not polite interest, not cautious approval. They loved them. The moment a cold-footed surfer slips into a pair of sheepskin boots after a long session in the Pacific, that moment sells itself. Brian Smith had always known that. Now the world was beginning to find out. In the surf community, word travels fast. News that travels between people who share a lifestyle, a culture, a daily ritual. That kind of news is more powerful than any advertisement. Within weeks of the San Diego breakthrough, other surfers were asking about the boots. One by one, surf shop owners who had once laughed Brian Smith out the door began calling him back. The boots were selling themselves. Surfers were asking for them by name. For the first time since arriving in California, the business had real momentum. Then came a phone call that no one could have planned for. A journalist from USA Today, one of the most widely read newspapers in America, called UGG Imports for what was supposed to be a brief background interview. The call lasted 5 minutes, but what followed would change everything. UGG appeared on the front page of USA Today's lifestyle supplement. Suddenly, the sheepskin boots that surf shop owners had once laughed at were reaching millions of American households over their morning coffee. It was the kind of exposure money simply cannot buy. The USA Today feature did something unexpected. It carried UGG boots far beyond the surf community and into the mainstream American consciousness. Suddenly, people in states that had no coastline were curious about sheepskin boots. The product was breaking out. California celebrities discovered UGG the way they discover most things, through proximity, through lifestyle, and through the simple truth that warmth and comfort are universal. Wearing sheepskin boots became a mark of laid-back West Coast cool, a counterintuitive status symbol. As demand began to grow, the van was no longer enough. Brian Smith had to build something resembling an actual company, a small warehouse, staff, orders, systems. It was still tiny compared to what the business would become, but it was real. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a complication simmered. In Australia, a man named Shane Steadman had registered the UGG name years earlier and would claim for decades, in ways that remained hotly disputed, to be the true originator of the UGG boot. The question of who invented the UGG became one of the more colourful footnotes in footwear history. Between 1978 and 1995, Brian Smith ran UGG Holdings without venture capital, without private equity backing, and without the safety nets that most modern startup founders take for granted. He figured it out year by year, shipment by shipment, sale by sale. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of sustained belief. By 1995, it was clear to Brian Smith that scaling UGG beyond its regional surf brand status would require a level of capital and infrastructure that he simply didn't have. Deckers Corporation, a footwear company based in Goleta, California, had been watching UGG's growth. The conversations began. In 1995, Brian Smith sold UGG Holdings to Deckers Corporation for approximately $14.6 million. For a man who had started the company from the back of a van at Malibu Beach, it was vindication on a monumental scale. And for Deckers, it was arguably the best investment in footwear history. Deckers Corporation brought to UGG what Brian Smith had never had: capital, distribution infrastructure, retail relationships, and a marketing machine. Under Deckers, UGG would be transformed, not abandoned, but amplified. The small surf brand was about to become something unrecognizable. Deckers' first major investment in UGG was in product development. The original boot, honest, simple, functional, became the foundation for a full collection. New heights, new colors, new silhouettes. The sheepskin boot was being reimagined for a mainstream global market. From a van in a Malibu parking lot to flagship stores on Rodeo Drive, Fifth Avenue, Bond Street, and the Champs-Élysées, UGG's retail footprint would eventually span dozens of countries and hundreds of locations, a global monument to a young Australian's bet on sheepskin. $2 billion in annual revenue, a brand recognized on every continent, a global cultural symbol. And at the origin of all of it, a young Australian surfer, a song on a radio, a van at Malibu, and a simple pair of sheepskin boots. Brian Smith didn't just build a company, he built proof that the most powerful ideas are often the simplest ones, and that the distance between obscurity and legacy is nothing but time and refusal to quit. Thanks for watching. More videos to come on disruption makers. Stay tuned and please subscribe.